Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation. I would like to introduce our presenter, Dan Robinson. He is the Chief of Research and Analysis at the Alaska Department of Labor and Workforce Development. Dan writes frequently about the state's economy and job market. His team at Research and Analysis produced many of the state's key economic data sets, including job numbers, wages, unemployment rates, and demographic information on population and migration data. Today's session will be recorded and available on the FNSB Community Research website. If you have any questions throughout the session, please use the raise your hand feature or type your question into the chat box. Thank you for being here, and please take it away, Dan.
Thanks, Stephanie. Tell me if my volume's it's not high enough or low enough. You can see my slides, right?
Yes, everything's good to go.
Okay, very good. And I'll kind of rely on you to watch for raised hands or Q&As. Happy to answer questions as we go, especially anything that clarifies something, so that nobody's lost in a chart that I've labeled clumsily. The first thing I wanted to talk about a little bit, and the title kind of gives it away, is which is a good thing, is this annual task we undertake here, which is to forecast employment for statewide, Southeast, Anchorage, and Fairbanks. It's I'm not expecting you to read this text. I wanted to point you to it. It's in the January issue of Alaska Economic Trends. If you haven't seen it, it doesn't have the level of detail that you would know. What we hope it does is reflect the kind of the macroeconomic look at what's happening, what has been happening, what the trends are, the strengths and weaknesses in your economy, and then of course the output is what we think is going to happen in 2023. So if you haven't seen that, I encourage you to take a look. This slide shows the percent change, and the label says broadly what we think, which is more job growth, but not particularly strong growth in 2023. Fairbanks total employment, and just a little orientation here. When we talk employment, we're talking wage and salary employment. So that's the part of the economy where you get a paycheck. It does not include the self-employed, and it does not include uniformed military. So there are, especially uniformed military for Fairbanks, important parts of the working world that aren't captured in our standard data sets. What we try to do is write about that periodically. The data is harder to come by, but we do try to write about it once in a while. In the February issue of Trends, we did an article on self-employment, for example, to help us and readers kind of quantify how many additional people are out there working that aren't in this category. And then military, you heard from David Howell a couple of weeks ago from our shop here. We work as hard as we can with the military to get accurate counts of who's coming and going. Deployments make that challenging and interesting. But just remember that this is those of us, and it's most of the people who work, who get a monthly or bi-monthly or bi-weekly paycheck. And jumping to the next slide, these are some broad themes from the article. Your losses in Fairbanks, your job losses, were less severe than the state overall, than Anchorage, than Southeast. And you can see the details there that Southeast lost 13.5% of its jobs. And this would be a monthly average for the year, these counts that I'm going to talk about now. So, and the COVID timing was interesting. As you remember, January and February, things were normal, and then March, April, things really fell much lower. Lots of things shut down. So Southeast from 2019 to 2020 lost 13.5% of its jobs. Anchorage 7.9, and the Fairbanks North Star Borough 6.6. And if we were in person, I would ask you to shout out some of the reasons you think that was the case, why Fairbanks kind of managed, I don't know, manages is the right word, I guess, traversed the pandemic period without as big of job losses as some other parts of the state. But so here is what we think are the reasons, and some of these would be hard to really argue with. There would be some additional smaller possibilities, but you are, as important as tourism is to Fairbanks, it's not as big of a percentage of your economy as it is in Southeast, for example, with cruise ship tourism, and you get plenty of cruise ship related tourism there as people take buses into the interior. But it's a smaller chunk of your economy. And then the stability, in particularly of the military bases, their work lives changed a lot, but they didn't have job losses. Military objectives, importance doesn't go away during a pandemic. And then UAF broadly, it's a university and in government generally tends to be a stabilizing force. That's not always the case, and Alaska's got some challenges along those lines now, but having UAF there is an asset in terms of stability. It likely was an asset. And then something else we speculated a little bit on in the article, that Fairbanks local government may have managed the pandemic a little bit differently. Mat-Su did, for example, than Anchorage. Fewer business closures, so there were fewer losses in this category that was hit by far the hardest, called leisure and hospitality. So that's the restaurants and bars and hotels, but hotels were relevant, but especially restaurants and bars. The strengths looking forward to 2023 that we identify in this article, there's a lot of Infrastructure Act money coming to Alaska. The timing is imprecise. They're good people tracking this, but there's way more questions and answers about the specifics of when that money will hit. It's on a basic 5-year timeline, and the most recent estimate that we've seen from credible sources, about $3 billion coming to Alaska overall. So it's a lot of money. We're going to talk in a minute about labor shortages and the kind of difficulty in staffing up to spend some of this Infrastructure Act money. But without question, it's an economic strength for Fairbanks and the state in 2023. Tourism is expected to be quite strong in 2023. Your tourism-specific revenue jumped, as many of you on this call may know, in 2022. And it's almost sure to jump again. Well, I won't talk about revenue, things I don't understand well enough to talk about for you specifically, but cruise ship traffic to Alaska and probably independent travelers to Alaska, absent some new shock between now and summertime, it's likely to be a very strong year. And there's some fun, interesting reasons for that that we could get into another time. And then another strength that you have that's kind of unusual for the state of you have had some recent population growth because of the military, probably, and new home construction. We have a graph in this article, but here again, that's a combination of needing more housing and building some of the housing you need. But like with housing markets across much of the country, there's at least short term a strong demand for more housing, and especially some certain types of housing, middle income and low middle, maybe high middle. But this population growth and the fact that there is some home construction happening, that equates to jobs. And then the weaknesses that we talked about in this article going forward into 2023, this is the big state government challenge of funding, stability, uncertainty. There were big cuts to the university a few years ago. There's been some new reports out about fewer Alaskans attending college and university in state. We just wrote an article looking at the class of 2005 high school graduates, where they went to college, where the effect going to college out of state had on whether they come back to work in Alaska's economy. So that's a challenge in Alaska that other states' universities are not facing to that degree. We're still figuring out kind of the next era maybe of state government. As oil revenue has declined, we've tapped into POMV for part of our money, and excuse me, throwing out that acronym. We won't talk about that unless there are specific questions. But all that to say that there's some hefty challenges at the state government level, and that translates to challenges for UAF. Your K-12 enrollment is down. It popped up a little bit in 2022, I think, after the pandemic declines, but still 7.3% below pandemic level. Lots of arguments that you've probably seen if you're watching the legislature about the BSA, whether we need to spend more, if we do spend more, how we're going to pay for it, and those kinds of things. And then housing, I think I talked about it enough before. It's a mix, but it really is an important factor in what's happening in local economies and the desirability or the ability to live in certain places. If you can't afford a house, your roots are shallower. You know, if you love a place and want to commit to a place and you can't find a house, you might sour on that decision and decide somewhere else. It kind of invites the question, well, where is housing especially affordable? And it really isn't in most of the country. And there are also shortages in large parts of the country. Some exceptions in the parts of the country that have kind of been left behind. But housing's I guess up and down, but more of a challenge than an asset right now. The need to build housing will create some jobs. So I'm going to move now to the, I think, biggest current statewide economic question. It's the one that we probably get the most requests to weigh in on. It's on lots of different groups' minds, whether they're businesses, state government, the workforce development community, policymakers, people. Well, I probably preaching to the choir that this issue of it being harder than it used to be to fill open positions is a big deal right now. And I'm going to show you a few data points, and then we can talk later about some of your observations, I hope. But so this is from a Bureau of Labor Statistics product called JOLTS, Job Opening and Labor Turnover Survey. And just to get oriented here, the scale on the left is US numbers in thousands. So the US, the blue line, we start out in 2012 with 3.7 million job openings. Then by 2022, that number has risen to 11.2 roughly million job openings. So about a 2.5-fold increase. Alaska is the scale on the right, also in thousands. So we go from having 12,000 job openings to about 32,000 in the most recent year. And one point is notice how the job openings were increasing before COVID hit. And a job opening, it's a definition that I like here. It's not kind of fuzzy. I'd like to hire more people if I could, or sometimes government talks about openings or positions in a vague way. These are positions that the companies surveyed are actively recruiting to fill. They're looking to fill them, and they would fill them within a month if the right candidate showed up. So they're trying to get these positions filled. They're unable to the degree shown here. Uh, so one response to this data, and even more to the reality of companies not being able to fill positions, companies, all employers, my shop here, we're all, to the extent you're looking for applicants, something has changed from pre-pandemic. And so one of the responses during the pandemic, there was some chatter about we're paying people too much not to work. So the unemployment insurance benefit went up. And that's not an illogical question to ask. When we looked at the data here, and national studies confirmed the same thing, that was never really not even a sizable part of the reason. One of this study we did, we looked at people who were working pre-pandemic who hadn't yet come back. And one of the findings there was that of that group, they were quite unlikely to have ever, or much less likely than the people who left and did come back. The people who left and hadn't come back were less likely to have ever filed for unemployment insurance. The other one, the most interesting finding, I think, is that they were disproportionately workers who were 60 plus. And when I say disproportionately, I mean, you look at how many left, you need to look at how many normally leave, and the number who left and didn't come back in that 60 plus group was unusually high. So we speculate a little bit that they, either because of vulnerability to COVID, or maybe their job changed enough, if they're a school teacher, a school nurse, or not a school nurse, so anything in healthcare, it got the basic ask of the employment changed, plus some vulnerabilities for COVID, so they retired a little bit early. That's probably most likely. And then there were also some slightly disproportionate women in their 30s who left and haven't come back, and we suspect that's the increasing difficulty in finding childcare, affordable childcare, any slots at all, as the most likely single factor. Impossible to know with any certainty. The one response, I kind of started to head this direction, that people have said, so there's the unemployment insurance, we're paying people not to work, and there were always some problems definitionally and the assumptions of that, and then the data didn't support that. But the other thing we're hearing a lot now is people just don't want to work anymore. You know, kids these days, people don't want to work anymore. So this is probably the best data available to test that hypothesis. And what this is Alaska's labor force participation rate. And to be in the labor force, you either have to be working or actively looking for work. So this is the percent of our 16 years and older population who either are working or and actively looking for work means you're taking concrete steps within a month. And what you see here is, one thing first, from left to right, you see a downward sloping line. So that means a smaller percentage of our 16 years and older population was in the labor force. And the ones who aren't in the labor force, definitionally, these are people who either don't want to work, or they say they want to work, but they're not actively looking for a job. So that percentage was declining before we get to COVID. And do pay attention to the scale. These declines aren't huge, but we go from almost 69% down to 64% in the time period closest to the COVID dip. So what's almost certainly going on there is simply baby boomers aging out of their working age, increased retirements. It makes sense that if more people are older, then a smaller percentage of the population is going to be working. But notice post-COVID, and I see a Q&A pop up. Stephanie, I'll let you jump in when it makes sense to you. I just see there is one. I don't see the details.
Sure. The question is, do you have a breakdown of this information by age?
So it kind of, and I half wondered if you were going to say by more detailed geography. In both cases, even at this level, during COVID, the data is fairly squishy. So there's quite good national data of this type, labor force participation by age. For Alaska, the data would be not very good. And when I say not very good, I mean imprecise. And it would be so not really. But whoever asked that question, there are some things we can do with this survey that mostly is responsible for this is called the Current Population Survey. And there's also something called the American Community Survey that helps break down by age and gender how many people are working and how many people are looking for work and how many people are not in the labor force for different reasons. And there were some interesting trends before this. Males, for example, were their labor force participation rate had fallen in recent decades, and females it had gone up a little bit. So yeah, please get in touch and we can talk about what there is and maybe with some caveats about how good it is. So back to this chart, what you see post-COVID is the labor force participation rate actually goes up for a while and peaks at 66%. And then the most recent month is at 65.3%. So when to the extent somebody's trying to convince you that nobody wants to work anymore, that's mathematically not true. People don't, to the extent you trust this data set, and I trust it well enough for that conclusion, people have not, as a group, 16 plus, stopped wanting to work because of COVID. It's simply not true. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a minute. The problem with saying that concerns me quite a bit, and the smartest employers, I think, are all over this. It's going to be harder to compete for the available workers. There are fewer of them and they have a lot of options. The problem with saying people don't want to work anymore is you don't correctly diagnose the problem, so you don't see a need to change. And change means change your recruitment practices, change your what you're doing to retain good employees, thinking about what makes a good place where people want to work, becoming a better employer. So if you say people don't want to work anymore, it's not your fault, and you sit and probably start a path that has you going out of business while the other businesses that kind of see that's not the problem's something else, and they start to do something about it. And this workforce development group or the community that I mentioned, part of what they can do, and we hope we're helpful to them, is tap into some of these underutilized populations. So older workers may stay around longer if they have more flexibility, or if they can work 6 months of the year and spend part of the year somewhere else. Prisoner reentry. There are a lot of people who go into prison, and we've kind of clumsily said you can't work a whole lot of jobs. So that's an underutilized population. Disabled workers is an underutilized population. Military spouses. There are things we can do to tap into these potentially available workers that we haven't had to do to the same degree as we do now. And that's a broad category of things, but that's the other part of that. One, businesses are going to, and all employers, think about how they do everything, and then the system is going to, I hope, need to get smarter about using some of these people who do want to work and maybe have always wanted to work to a degree, but haven't been able to for different reasons. And this, I alluded to this is Alaska's working age population, 18 to 64, defined here. And notice a couple of things. One, we had a roughly 20% increase from 2000 to 2013. That's a pretty big increase, 2%. And that's normal. Populations tend to grow at all levels. Baby boomers are a little bit of a challenge that way, but most relevantly here, notice that we've had about a 30,000 magnitude decrease in our working age population. So do people not want to work anymore, or are there fewer people to work? The correct answer is the second. That's a 6% decline. So that's a pretty good decrease in just the number of people of that prime working age that are available to work. And some of this, the first chart, you see this, it's national. There are national factors at work, the baby boomers being one of them. But some of it is particular to Alaska. And this map highlights that over this 2013 to 2021 period, Alaska, only West Virginia has had a larger decrease in its working age population. Alaska and Wyoming are in the next tier. We've lost between 5 and 7.5, 7.4% of our working age population. And some of that is this negative net migration. Well, not some of it, most of it. The most states are going through the same basic demographic trends in terms of the baby boomers aging out of their working ages. But as you can see, plenty of states are growing or seeing their 18 to 64 working age population grow. They're Mountain West states. You see Northwest states there, Washington and Oregon. You see southern warm weather states, Florida, Texas, Arizona. And you see in general losses in the Northeast. Northeast tends to be older, colder. Baby boomers, not too many of them are retiring from Manhattan to Boston. I mean, they might spend some of their year in beach parts of the Northeast, but when people get older and retire, they tend to go south. And there's some other kind of smaller, interesting things to consider about the states that are gaining people from these migration trends. So back to Fairbanks to put some numbers on those things that I talked about at the statewide level. From 2015 to 2020, Fairbanks lost about 1,400 people due to migration. And numerically, the biggest losses were 15 to 19-year-olds and 60 to 64-year-olds. The 15 to 19-year-olds caught my attention partly because as a university town, it wouldn't be surprising to see a net gain in 15 to 19-year-olds. But Alaska and even Fairbanks, this is true of Anchorage too, we've for as long as we've been looking at this data, maybe early 80s would be an exception, I'd have to look, we send more of our students out of state than we import into the state. And some of that's a young university. And that doesn't mean we don't bring students from other parts of the country and world to UAF and UAA and the other parts of the APU, the other parts of the post-secondary university college system here. But over this period, we lost more than we gained, and that's typical, like I said. And then 60 to 64-year-olds, we've long, and David showed you this a couple of weeks ago, if anyone was here then, that Alaska does tend to lose more people as they start to reach retirement age than they gain.
We have a question in the chat right now.
Yeah, let's hear it.
Okay. This is from Brittany Smart. Is there a way to track net migration of employment and the impact that has on our ability to fill local positions, i.e. Alaska available workforce employed in remote positions across the country/globe?
Yeah, fun question. So not really well. We do an annual report on percent non-resident workers in Alaska. So that gets that part of that. How many people are coming to Alaska and working here without ever becoming residents? How many Alaskans are working from other places? There are kind of efforts underway to code those people a certain way, but we rely on employers to decide, not to decide, to be willing to provide the data. And decide came to mind because I think sympathize with this. It hasn't settled yet how much we're going to accept working from home, working remotely. There's the big COVID necessity, and then, hey, not everybody. A lot of people love working from home, and they insist on being able to. But then some of the employers say, no, this isn't working. Everybody come back, and there's a little bit of a tug of war happening. How comfortable both sides are with where we are now. So some of that is still under development. It hasn't settled. But there are efforts to get employers to tell us that their GCI employee, for example, is going to be living and working out of Spokane or whatever it is. But there's national surveys, so there's not great data, but it's astute, I think, to see that as a factor. And one thing it highlights, I think, is the importance of being a place, to the extent we can control this, where people want to live. What makes a place somewhere where people want to live? It depends on who you ask. Some common things, though, is a good K-12 system. If you don't have good local schools, that's gonna affect a big group of people who may want to otherwise live somewhere. Housing is another one. Obviously, jobs, weather we can't do anything about. I think functional institutions broadly. You think of you feel like the government is competent at doing the things government does, courts and plowing roads and keeping potholes filled and all those things. But the communities, the places who do that best will benefit, because they'll be the places people will want to live. So looking ahead, so this is 2015 to 2020. We went back 5 more years, and over this period, because part of the challenge is diagnosing the problem. To the extent you define this as a problem, losing people from your community, what are the causes? And looking at when it started is a good clue. So from 2010, 2015, we had similar losses. The exception is that there were small net gains. So more 20 to 24-year-olds moved to Fairbanks than moved away. And some of that is military. And if we go a little farther back, even from 2005 to 2010, now you've got more people moving to Fairbanks than moving away from Fairbanks. Interestingly, even here, I said it's been a fairly constant phenomenon. There are more 15 to 19-year-olds, college-age kids, roughly, leaving Fairbanks than moving to Fairbanks. Alaska's generally has a strong pull for people in their 20s and 30s. We have great trails and hunting and fishing and beautiful mountains and all kinds of things that appeal to people in those age groups. And then on top of that, Fairbanks has the military, which brings a lot of people, most recently the F-35, a little bit older, but late 20s, early 30s. And then, as I say at the last bullet, that's a similar story in terms of more people moving to Fairbanks than out of Fairbanks from 2000 to 2005. And that is my last slide, and I would be happy to answer any questions or hear any rebuttals, comments. And I've got a Q&A or raise your hand, either one. And if you're had all you can take, then we can do other things.
I am not seeing anything so far. All right. Well, one just popped up. Ms. Robin says, could you talk more about how employers could better diagnose their problems?
Yeah, so Um, one slide that I put is it's titled "Give Workers More of What They Say They Want," and there have been some surveys during COVID, and especially during COVID, I think, because you've heard the Great Resignation and quiet quitting and all these kind of, some of them too cute, some of them they capture something important. But and I think I had 6 or 7 things on that list from the different things workers said they wanted when surveyed. So money's an obvious one, but some of that are less obvious were I think number 2 on some of the surveys were respect, meaningful work. We don't want to feel, and I think COVID, there one analyst, one guy who studies the reasons people quit called it the phenomenon pandemic epiphanies. People insisted more because life got precious. Things got a little scary for a while, and people wanted their work to mean more. So that whole figuring out what, and you can do this. Almost everybody can do this, I think, if they think about it a little bit. Think of how you define what working for your company or your research shop or your whatever, all the different possibilities, how you define that, and whether you as a boss believe it. So meaningful work was interesting to me. Flexibility was one, and that could be scheduling, that could be working from home or not. Some bosses, we come across this in anecdotes and chatter, they want things to be the way they've always been. It bothers them, the idea of flexibility, because they didn't have that when they were working, or different things like that. I'm not sure that's productive. Trying to think of the other things on that list. Opportunity for advancement was one that I remember. As you think about this, it's recruitment partly, but retention is really important. And if you have to pay new workers more, think about what that means to your existing workers, because there is some data suggesting the workers who are getting the most out of the wage increases are the ones who are job hopping. So you don't want to lose the workers you do have because they feel like the only way they can get a raise is to take a job somewhere else. Okay. I saw another
Yes, we do. Yep. Katie Whiteside asks, FNSB area student age population is declining. Is this expected to exacerbate the availability of workers into the next decade? Yes, definitely. The number of people aging out is bigger than the number of people aging in. David Howell, who talked to you a couple of weeks ago, those of you who were on that call, we do long-term population projections. That will eventually work its way out. But for the next, I mean, you think of the baby boomers, they're people born from 46 to 64. So the oldest of them will turn 60 next year. So we've got some more aging out still in that pipeline. And the younger age groups are smaller, and birth rates are going down a little bit. And then most importantly, in terms of how many working age people will have, is that migration piece. Are you bringing young families in? Are you bringing people of working age into Fairbanks? If so, your working age will grow. If not, if all that happens, even if that's flat, even if the exact same number leave as stay for a while, your working age population will decline just because of the baby boomers and the smaller groups of the young people coming into the workforce. We have another question in the chat. Jeff Putnam.
Yeah.
What industries in Alaska have the greatest workforce deficit?
Yeah, I just talked to a healthcare group yesterday, and there's not good data at the industry level from that survey that I showed you, like JOLTS, Job Opening Labor Turnover Survey. But nationally, the question there was whether healthcare was having a particularly hard time in terms of the number or rate of job openings. The answer was yes, not surprisingly. healthcare, and healthcare was struggling to fill open positions before the pandemic. So they're interesting. They worked to figure that out. I'm not sure they did, but one interesting thing as I was thinking about that for them is they, to a degree, had to change their business model. They brought in more traveling nurses. There's talk and even action now to bring nurses from the Philippines, for example. So they're a little more familiar with this problem. Construction and the trades are really hungry for workers, and people. The apprenticeships are growing, and outside of the trades, interestingly now too. But because of the Infrastructure Act money, maybe a little bit of growing housing construction, there's a real hunger for workers in construction. I'm trying to think of where else. You maybe saw there was news yesterday that the state is going to study whether certain positions still should require degrees. So that the state government, and I suspect local, I talked to city of Juneau and then city of Soldotna last week about things they're doing to change the set of benefits and wages a little bit, but they were doing some sabbatical stuff. They were doing some childcare things. So it broadly, it's across the board. I would say healthcare and construction would stand out. Oh yeah, so Jeff, I saw your other question about licensure reciprocity. So we don't take the lead in pushing anything through that's a policy decision, but we really hope that the policy makers use our information to help decide what policies they're going to advocate for. And I don't know where they are with reciprocity for military spouses, and reciprocity even more broadly is an interesting question. We sometimes erect clumsy barriers to people working who they're here, they're qualified by an objective definition, and yet there's some regulatory or somebody's decided that we're not going to let them work for 90 days or whatever. So we are aware of that to the extent the data people are here. We would be on the fringes and like I said, not part of a push, except to say there's a need to, employers have made clear and the data show clear that we need more people who are qualified and able to work to be able to work.
There was another question from Jeff there. I think you might have skipped past it, or maybe you answered it with both of them. In your opinion, what are the top 2 or 3 things that could reverse the net migration that has been happening since 2013?
Well, David talked to you about this a little bit, and it was interesting. He talked about how the other periods where we've had negative net migration, we've been able to point to some reasons. Very broadly, we have negative net migration when the future and job future looks brighter in the places people move to or from than in Alaska. So that's part of it. But that kind of begs the question, why have things been a little darker here relative to job markets and other things outside of Alaska? And I think one of the really important factors is this messiness as we've wrestled with the state budget, that it's hard for these really important institutions to do good work and to get better at what they're doing if they're fighting for their survival annually, while we argue over, and they're hard political arguments, the dividend, whether we're going to pay taxes, if we're going to cut what we're going to cut. So that lack of stability is what I would say the number one thing that would stabilize things, and then hopefully some of the institutions that are struggling could start to make some progress in the other direction. Beyond that, I talked a little bit about quality of life, and that's really a local government. You can't decide whether you can't do much about whether the restaurants in your community are great, but you can have good trails and arts but also acknowledging some people value low taxes more than those kinds of things. So it's messy. But I talk too much. That stability is the main thing I would focus on.
Okay, we have one more question in the chat. Ms. Robin asks, does government have a role in workforce development, such as today's DOWL announcement about UAF training in Tok for Tetlin mining jobs?
I haven't seen that specific announcement yet, but the direct answer to the question is absolutely. A good university system, for example. Yesterday in this healthcare meeting that I mentioned, they said that there are 3 ready and willing applicants for nursing programs for every 1 they can admit. So we've got a shortage of nurses. We've got people who want to become nurses. What we don't have is enough training capacity to get them through to where they can become nurses. So most obviously, and K-12 would even be part of that. You have good K-12, you have good university and post-secondary things, which includes apprenticeships and job training. Some AvTech that in Seward exists partly to do that. But training workers and helping fund that is economically smart if you do it well. You don't want to do it sloppily because you can throw money, you can waste money in any effort. But yes, absolutely.
I don't see any hands raised or questions in the chat. Does anybody else have any more questions? Oh, Miss Robin says, thank you for the presentation.
You are very welcome, Miss Robin. Thank you.
Okay, unless anybody else has questions, we'll wrap this up. Thank you, Dan, for the wonderful presentation. It was very, very interesting. This session was recorded and can be found on the FNSB Community Research Quarterly website soon. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in this webinar series, and we look forward to your participation in our next data event.
you